Hello, I'm Richard Gerver. I'm a former educator, advisor, and expert in human potential and leadership. And today I'm here to discuss education and the future with Phillip Ullmann as part of his Five Masters series. So, Phillip, there is so much to talk about in terms of the way we need to change the world. And I guess wouldn't I, ask you about how we build that foundation from our youngest upwards? Because it seems to me, and I'm an optimist, that every great period of human darkness is followed by a renaissance, an explosion in human innovation and transformation. And I feel that what you're talking about so powerfully in this series are the levers by which we can make that renaissance happen. But it can only start from the bottom with our children. So what are your views about how we catalyze that transformation and make it stick so it doesn't just feel like a short-term answer to a long-term problem?
It reminds me of things you've actually taught me, which is fascinating because we've discussed these issues over the years. I remember you telling me that a child grows exponentially from when they're born. Is it until about 4 or 5, something along those lines? You put them in a school and you look at the rate of development and suddenly they don't. Effectively, what that's saying to me is that we're trying to control them too much. So they start as a baby with an ego. Mm-hmm. I think babies don't recognize anyone else. So and therefore they cry to get attention. And the only way of educating them is actually telling them what to do, because they don't. If a child walks into the road, a gentle check, no, that's not a good idea, isn't really going to save their lives. You're going to have to yank them back and actually actively get involved. But as they get older, they start to develop their own egos. So the psychiatrists or psychologists say you move from egocentric to ethnocentric, which means you're focused on the group, to sociocentric, where you're focused on the wider society. So I think our education must recognize that. And effectively, the ego, which is massive when they're a child, we have to tame that so they start to be, but not crush it. We must allow them to retain their identity, but start to get them to understand the family and the community in stage 2, and start to build a we identity alongside the I identity. And then when they go from ethnocentric to sociocentric, again, they've got to broaden their horizons, but taming the group ego, but not crushing the group ego and going to a wider ego. So what we have to do is constantly allow them to be confident in their own ability and recognize their own identity, but not crush other groups and not crush other people.
I think what you're saying is really interesting. I think the first thing, just to go back on, is the fact that as very young children, we learn very quickly that actually our survival depends on relationships. It relies on us smiling up at our mother or father when we're hungry, of crying, of those fundamental basics, which in many ways are so covenantal, because it's about a deep understanding. It's not about me as a child giving you money. It's not about me as a child paying you for my care. It's me as a child building relationships with you. And so I think in some ways it's a natural state for us. And I think you're right. You know, the question we have to ask ourselves is what happens? Where does that go? So if, as some experts claim, we learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lifetime before we're 5, you know, those fundamental things, most of us learn to walk and talk, to understand vocal intonation, facial expression, body language. We learn to make sense of the sensory world around us. If we're born into a multilingual home, we pick up every language spoken in our domestic environment. And then everything slows down. And this thing that I really want to get to is that next phase with you, which is this societal need, it seems, to profess to people that their lives will only succeed if they're prepared to be controlled. Because what we do in formal education then is we say to children, park your interests, park your natural aptitudes, because when we do formal education, we're going to tell you what's important, we're going to tell you why it's important, and then we're going to test you to make sure that you can prove that what we've told you is important is now important. And I think in a way it's why our curiosity then diminishes, and why to an extent we then end up in adult life where so many of us may feel frustration, anger, fear about the lives we're leading and the paths we've been taken down. We don't know how to take control back for ourselves. And it strikes me that that's a fundamental part of what you're talking about.
Absolutely right. I couldn't agree more with everything you're saying. Let me just develop the idea in an important way. In terms of how you get people to fully develop themselves and to grow. So you start with a child, and you may smack the child. I didn't say that because I'm going to get in trouble. But occasionally, when a child is very naughty, you tell them off strongly, put them on a naughty step, whatever. And then you get to the next stage when they're in school, and you use the carrot and the stick, combined. So you may give them sweets, or you give them later on money, and that's a stage in development where they're learning and they don't understand the concept of relationships and love properly yet, and therefore we use a substitute, which is the stick and the carrot. What we then do is when we go to out into the workplace, we haven't graduated to recognise that in fact you don't need huge amounts. You need to meet your needs, but once you've got them, the carrot and the stick doesn't work anymore, and it's about loving relationships. It's about building relations with others, and people don't grow up. They think that they need more and more and more. They don't, and therefore this stages of development is critical, and we need to start to educate people into recognizing you don't need money. Doesn't give it. I mean, we all know that the research is there. Money does not give you the satisfaction.
Do you think, actually, again, being the optimist that I am, do you not think I see in some of our younger generations now a very different mindset and a growing frustration with the way the world turns traditionally? For example, it seems to me not necessarily all for good, but partly because of the catalyst that modern technology is, and partly because of the way that's helped young people change their view of the world. They're more naturally collaborative than maybe previous generations. They are more causal than previous generations. You know, I've over the years done work with a number of organizations, and one that sticks in my mind is working with a global lottery association, and them telling me, this is a decade ago now, that they were really struggling with their future model, because what they were finding was that Gen Z or Gen Z, or however we want to alphabetize our children, were not interested in lotteries because they weren't interested in simply material wealth. What they wanted was experiences. And it seems to me, and again, I want to hear from your expert view, particularly as somebody who used to work within the employment sector, that one of the challenges, of course, we face in the workplace is young people aren't necessarily motivated in the way previous generations were. They don't just want big bonuses. They don't want money. They want experiences. And actually, one of the challenges that leads to is they're not necessarily fixated on the idea of a 30-year career. They're interested in working for a period of time to put resource in their path so that then they can go off and have an experience. And so do you think that actually we don't need necessarily a wholesale re-engineering of a system? We need to be more cognizant of the way the direction of travel amongst new generations are moving. And maybe we need a system around education design that is more aligned to nudging them down the right pathways than re-engineering them.
Absolutely. So at Cordant, so we all gradually evolve our ideas as we grow. I had an epiphany, as Richard, you probably know, at about 52, where it suddenly dawned upon me that money wasn't everything, and that we have to build relationships, and purpose is critical. And as you know, we experimented with capping salaries, with focus on purpose. We tried to get our clients to pay a living wage. All of these ideas, but you're absolutely right. The kids get it better. It's natural. It's almost this point you say at 5, they're natural, but then we stop them behaving naturally. We actually curb their natural tendencies. And we don't allow them to thrive. And effectively, you're right. If we let them go within limits, be clear, there have to be limits set. They can't. But no question, it's more rather than controlling them. The way decisions are made, based on Laloux's work, is you either force people to behave in a certain way, which is the state commanding them, or the markets using advertising or other forms of behavior to force them to behave in a certain way. Or you have a vote, which is one way, and some decisions need to have votes, which maybe we could talk about democracy in a second, but that is necessary in some cases, but not in the workplace. And I'm sure in school, you're not going to vote about what to do tomorrow. There's a role for it, but not in every day. And then you've got what Lelouch calls the advice process, which is what you're describing, which is nudging, which is you have to recognize in a business that it's not about the current business model where the CEO or in a state where the prime minister or the cabinet make all the decisions and nothing is distributed. It's what we call the advice process. You have self-managing teams, which is close to the family of 10 people with all the skills working together with a purpose. And then everybody, whether it's marketing, sales, finance, advises them. You call it nudging them, so that you're building relationships and you're sharing ideas. And that is a much more advisory, supportive, collaborative model. And that's what needs to happen. And the civic trust, which I've written about, is just that. You start to, and that's central. It's a real, it's not communism, which is forced from the center. It's not capitalism, which is forced using money. It's actually letting go, but with limits.
I mean, what I remember very early on in our conversations, and I remember one of the things we started to bounce around as a core idea that you were starting to form at Cordon, was this idea of incentivizing people, particularly those people who, were finding themselves, if you like, in lower level jobs. How could we incentivize those people to do the right thing, to turn up on time, to do all the things that you've just described, which is we have to live as a society within rules, within expectations, within systems. And how could we reward those people in a way that wasn't just an extra £5 in their pay packet? And one of the things we started talking about, which has always really captured me, and I'd love to work up with you, is this idea that actually people earn education credits. And one of the things I'd love to move on to is this idea of education not just being a preparation for life, but being something that we can, and I think this has been brought into sharp focus, particularly since 2008, and again in the time we're living in now, that people should be able to reskill, re-knowledge throughout their lives. And one of the problems I think a lot of people find themselves in, particularly those who aren't fortunate enough to rise through the system and to be in high profile, hugely satisfying, purposeful work, is they feel trapped. And what we were talking about was this idea of saying to people who turned up on time, got their head down, did their job, that actually we're going to provide a way for you to go on a course, to learn something new, to find a way of educating an interest, a hobby, something that you're fascinated by. I'd love to just find out where you are on that now and whether you think that's something that should be core to what we're talking about.
Okay, there's 2 points I'd like to make. You're absolutely right. We have to remember that education doesn't always have to be utilitarian. It doesn't always have to be to get a different job. As Ken Robinson, who we both loved, it's creativity, being able to write music, being able to write literature, write poems, which I'm useless at, by the way. But no, because I wasn't properly educated. I just didn't have... in my case, it was a credential. I had to get a certain number of GCSEs and A-levels with good grades. And if the teacher of the subject wasn't good enough, I didn't do it. So I haven't got geography or history at O-level, which is bonkers. But that's the way it is. But what I'd love to do, if I'd been given the opportunity to get at what you call about educational credit, that needs to be creative to actually lead a fuller life could be achieved in a non-utilitarian way. But there's also the utilitarian function that the jobs we've got are currently meaningless. The system is completely controlling, so that the lawyers are process driven and are gatekeepers, the accountants are gatekeepers, the hedge fund managers. There's so many jobs which are meaningless that have to be replaced with the jobs that you and I love, which is education. In the school, the ratio of teachers to people should be closer to 1 to 2, because they change the kid's life, and the parents should be engaged in that process much more. And therefore, if we can get people to see education and all the changes that we're talking about, how we change the world, how we deal with the crash, it's education, and I want you to get involved in that process, because you're an expert in that, and what you did at Grange was phenomenal. That was unbelievable. You should read his book. I'm not advertising it, but it's absolutely phenomenal. He's full of ideas, and whenever we get together, the chemistry is good.
Well, thank you for that, Philip. And just to let people know that they can buy the book, which is the best thing to do. But, at Grange, and we go back really to the turn of the millennium, and a school that had lost its way, not because it was filled with bad people or unprofessional people or people who didn't care, far from it. It was filled with people who were directionless. And they were delivering an education system that had been delivered to them increasingly from on high. Short-term fixes. How do we get our grades up? How do we get more kids through the tests? How do we make sure Ofsted come and tick the boxes? So everyone had felt dehumanized, and something you talk a huge amount about, which is purpose. Purpose had been poured under layers of concrete of bureaucracy and expectation. And so really fundamentally, my job was to become the catalyst to reignite the purpose and passion in that community, and to ask two fundamental questions. How do we make education matter to these young people? Not in some sort of Catholic version of purgatory that they just have to go, the traditional idea is, well, trust us, when you're 18, it'll start to make sense, which frankly, I just don't think is good enough. That actually it matters every minute of every day. And going back to something we've talked about in our conversation before, why do young children learn at such a phenomenal rate? Because they're not learning to put intelligence in the bank for later. They're learning because they can see the demonstrable difference to them now. Play, when they play at being doctors, or they play at running a veterinary surgery, or having their own shop. What they're actually doing is learning through experience and action that has a cause and effect in the immediacy. And to an extent, for a lot of children, and certainly the ones at Grange, education had become so abstracted. It was about, well, just build this bank and one day it'll mean something. So that was the first thing. So it was about having to make a difference to the children. And the second was having a far greater clarity about what we wanted our children to look like as human beings when they left us, as people, not just as containers for knowledge and information, or an ability to get them to the next level of education for them to take more tests. It's always amazed me that education is the worst quiz show in the world, right? Because what is the prize for doing well in your exams? You get to take more exams. And then what happens if you get through those exams? You go to university. Fabulous. And what happens at university? Most of us end up having to take more exams. Well, I'm not entirely sure there's a tremendous incentive there. So those were the two things. How do we create an environment where young people feel that education mattered in the moment? And how do we have a clarity about what we want our young people to look like as human beings when they left us? And what we did was we built an education system centered on three aspects for our solution. It's not the global solution. It was very much, and I think this comes back to what you're passionate about and talk so much about, which is about local solutions to local problems, right? It's finding solutions that are unique. So when I share this, and when I wrote the book I wrote about the story, it wasn't a model, it was a process that I want people to go through. But we did three things very quickly. One, we created a town inside our school, which the children were trained by real experts to run themselves. So they had a political system, television station, radio studio, cafes, shops, museums.
It's amazing. And if we're trying to get democracy sorted, they're having experience of what democracy looks like.
Well, one of the things I've always believed is unless we actually teach democracy and civics explicitly in our education system, we cannot expect young people to grow and thrive in the possibilities of what a democracy could be. So yeah, our political system, our children went down to Westminster every year, the children who were elected to be part of the mayoral council, and they were taught about the responsibilities of civic democracy from their member of Parliament. They spent time in Westminster. So actually those children, as they grew up, were clued up and understood how to use democracy for themselves to make a difference to society. Because the whole thing about the town they ran in the school was the profits that were made by the businesses, if there were any, and some of the kids, by the way, were phenomenally entrepreneurial. That money had to go back to the council to be then spent back into the elements of the society where they could prove they were most needed. So, for example, if the museum run by the kids wanted to build its exhibit out or wanted to develop a little section on the history of pet care in the community, they would have to go back to the council, bid for some of that money and say, we need X amount. And the reason we need X amount is because we'll have that exhibition, and that exhibition will impact on our society this way. Now, remember that when I talk about Grange, we're not talking about an 11 to 18-year-old school. We're talking about children who were 3 to 11. And they were writing complex business and community impact plans between the ages of 3 and 11 years of age. So we had this town. We had people like the BBC come and train the kids to run the media team. We had MPs teaching them about politics. We had historians and museum curation experts teaching them about. So this was really done in a very real, substantive way. That was number one. Number two was we tried to develop elements of our curriculum that weren't just specifically about subjects. Because again, for me, it seems an extraordinary thing that we teach children until 18 in almost unique subject areas. Yet when you're 23, 24, 25 in the modern workplace, nobody says, right, between 9 and 10 o'clock, you're going to a meeting where you're going to need mathematics exclusively. And then at 11 o'clock, you're going to a lesson where you might need modern foreign languages, right? It's a kind of, it's bringing those things together. So we had to have an element in our curriculum where those things were possible. So we had a sub-curriculum where there were 4 core themes: communication, enterprise, culture, and well-being in all of its forms. And that created a kind of project base where we could catalyze the knowledge and skills they were learning in their core curriculum in ways that would be immediately demonstrable, real, and contextual. And then the final part of what we did was we opened our own university for children between 3 and 11. On Fridays, they didn't come to school. They came to university, and there was a selection of upwards of 40 different courses which they could elect to take, 2 every term, 2 each semester. And when they graduated those courses, they had full details of what they'd learnt, the skills they'd developed, the interests they'd gained, went into a little folder, which we called their career entry profile, which we hoped that when they then moved on in their education, not only would they have the academic results, and by the way, if for anyone that wants to interrogate this nonsense of either or, our academic results went from below 50% to well above 90% pass rates in under 2 years. So it wasn't like we sacrificed anything. But what our children came out with was a far more rounded experience of the world, how learning could really make a difference to them, how it created aspiration and a sense of value. And I hope most proudly that, going back to the founding purpose of the town, that by becoming successful, that gave you the opportunity to help others rise up too.
Amazing. I mean, it's inspirational. I'd forgotten a lot of that stuff, but it's incredibly inspirational. What it says to me is, I remember the story, and he went from Ofsted special measures to Ofsted outstanding, which you didn't even mention. You didn't mention the fact that you're in the top 30th of the world's, for the last 4 years of the world's experts in education. But you are, because I think what happened to you there is, for a quirk, it wasn't supposed to happen. I remember you didn't even know what job you were really applying for, and the school was in trouble. But when you let somebody go and give them space, and funnily enough, you need to have a crash, which is interesting. It ties into what I was saying to Tom. You need to have a crash to give the people space, and then you evolve from the bottom upwards with no constraints. And that's what you can do. If we did the same thing with the economy, if when the money crashes, we then give people space, and you should get involved in that, because you naturally do work in that space. We start to re-educate, to start to build the ideas that you've described into society. Wow, what can we do? You're
right. But again, going back to this delicate balance, because I think it's so important when we're talking about all of the ideas that you've been discussing, is this delicate balance between giving people the freedom to evolve, to create, to innovate, but at the same time making sure people are accountable for their actions. And I think that, to me, is almost the most interesting juxtaposition that we've got to get at the heart at. So within education, we still have a responsibility to ensure that our children have the keys to the gates to the kingdom. And in the current flow of the way the world works, that meant they had to have qualifications, exam results, they had to have academic, they had to have a proven academic record, because it would be crassly irresponsible for us to go through a flight of fancy, and then for the children to come out at the other end of that process and not have those opportunities for those kids for whom university might be a great idea, for those kids that have aspirations down certain routes. And so for me, one of the most important things around leadership, and I'd love to come to this if I can, because let's be honest, leadership is so important in you catalyzing where the world needs to go, and at the same time, perversely right now, is holding us back from the direction we need to travel. Leadership for me is not about control. It's not about saying do this, do that, but it is about holding people's actions to account. So as a head teacher, my job was to help co-create with the community that sense of purpose, right? What do we want our kids to look like as human beings when they leave us? How do we make learning important? Now, what that did was gave me two clear questions I could interrogate anybody's actions against. And I wonder whether you feel that kind of approach is the way we find, nurture, and develop the real leadership that can make a meaningful difference.
Ken Robinson, I think, created the most watched TED Talk of all time. Is it 180 million or something? I forget where it is.
Just constant growth.
Constant growth. And your own TED Talk, which is a different aspect. You're an operator. I think what I see you did, you turned Ken's vision. Ken wasn't an operator. He was phenomenal at the vision. And again, which is another important message, you need visionaries together with operators to make anything happen. But let me ask you this, Richard. If we were discussing earlier about how the financial system is going to crash, it's because it's broken. And I'm not lacking hope. It's like exceptionally hopeful, as indeed you are. We're always optimists. So what we need to do is re-educate people in terms of what money actually is. How would you go about thinking about which is to us, the layman, how do you start to develop an educational process that actually helps people to be ready for when it happens to actually get involved in it? How would you do it?
Well, I think there's a number of responses to what you've said. The first is we need to understand what the block is at the moment. For me, the great challenge in education and education policy, not just in the UK, but in a lot of the most developed economies, is we are stuck in what I call the doom loop of the pursuit of efficiency. So in other words, we're seeing incredible innovations occur in our society. We're seeing some extraordinary challenges evolve and crystallize in our society, environmental, economic, social. We're seeing the explosion of artificial intelligence. We're seeing a world that is very, very different to the world we grew up in 40 or 50 years ago. But the education system and policy around education continues to be predicated on what I think is the mistaken belief that if we just get more efficient at doing what we've always done, we'll be okay. So if we get more kids through exams, if we get more kids to university, everything will work out all right. And in a way, that's the central challenge to how we re-engineer the way we think about the future.
So pick on that. It ties into what I was talking about in terms of the hospital. Efficiency is about money. It's about, so you've almost got two gods, two masters. Are you focused on purpose, on people, place, and planet? Or are you focused on efficiency or on a compulsory competitive tendering and money? And you're saying the same as me, is that we need to, dualism isn't going to work. You've got to be focused on purpose and people. And the efficiency, you've ended up with having two masters that you can't reconcile.
It's really interesting. A number of years ago, Manoush Shafiq, who I think is currently a director at the London School of Economics, was for a while the deputy governor of the Bank of England. And I think many people did predict for a while that she would be the first woman to break that glass ceiling and become governor. There's part of me that hopes that one day she does under whatever capacity it is. But at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, I think in 2018, she said, one of the reasons for the rise in populism around the world, a lot of the people that have voted for that populism are people from low education backgrounds. And what she said next was fascinating. She said, it's not because they're stupid, it's because they're clever. They've realized that the world isn't weighted in their favor. And they've been led down a path to believe that if you get your head down, do what you're told and do it efficiently, the world will give you the reward of certainty. And that reward has never shown itself. And I think we have to take that very, very seriously in the context of everything we're talking about. So if we're talking about the future of education, I think we've got to find a way to move away from the model that says, if you get your head down, perfect the art of doing exactly what you're told as efficiently as possible, you'll be rewarded, to a system that actually, and this may sound flaky to some, but we can get behind the weight and grist of this later in terms of policy. We need to create a system that is focused far more powerfully on empowerment and opportunity. So going back to what we were talking about with the ideas we floated around in terms of providing education credit for those people that already found themselves down one path, if you like, in jobs that had low sense of purpose, and all the rest of it. I think what we need to do is create an education system which gives people opportunity to learn new things in new moments as we develop through our lives, new interests. We all go through periods of hobby and interest. We go through things that catch fire. And I think if in formal education, we could help young people take the things they're passionate about and interested about and show them how they could use that in the future as a career, as a way of working, as a way of providing society with better, how they could create value. Ultimately, I don't believe our current education system allows young people to leave the system feeling that they are of value and of purpose. In many ways, a huge percentage of our young people leave the education system realizing what they're rubbish at and how much they've failed in, rather than what they're great at and what they could contribute to. So in a way, we're starting from a zero-sum game. Most people walk into adult life feeling that they'll never achieve the things they were passionate about. They're never going to get the opportunities to do the things that really mattered to them. So they're always going to be living a life where they feel controlled and where they feel missed opportunity.
Ties beautifully into the kind of three objectives that I mentioned of governance and government. One, meaningful employment. You've answered it. You've got to give people the scope via education credits, via ideas, so they actually can thrive and can stop being constrained by the system, but actually empowered by the system. And then you'll end up not having lawyers and accountants doing things that they hate and hedge fund managers. They will naturally move into those caring professions where they look after people and they look after the planet. And they'll love it because that's where they really get. So I think that answers the question about meaningful employment. Now, the next one is actually zero inflation. So how we want to educate people in that we don't need prices to continue to go up. We don't need to focus on the individual, on me, which is what inflation is. It's all about, when we focus on the shareholder, it's all about the individual. Could you educate people to start focusing on the we rather than just the I? How would you go about doing that?
Absolutely. I think children are, as we've talked through our conversation, I think children are naturally see the world in that collaborative way. When they start to toddle, when they start to learn, when they go to playgroup and nursery, they start to collaborate. One of the things that fascinates me is there's very little ego in one way in those young children, right? If they can't do something, they go and find somebody who can help them to do it. They don't hide behind the fact they can't do it or see it as a weakness. So I think we are naturally predisposed to be collaborative. We are naturally predisposed to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses and to harness that potential. What we need to an extent, and though this may sound unpalatable to some, is move away from a formal education system which is actually predicated on, I've got to be better than you. And also predicated on the idea that collaboration is cheating. It's extraordinary to me that what we say to young people is you've got to get better grades than her or him or them, because that means you'll get a better place at a better university on a better course, which means you'll earn more money than them, which means you win, right? So we're teaching children from a very young age that it's about you're either a winner or a loser. That's the first thing. And the second thing about sitting down and learning in a classroom environment and thinking, I don't understand this, but I know Johnny next to me is brilliant at, let's say, algebra, which is the lesson we're in. Why can't I get Johnny to help me with my algebra? And I know Johnny's not very good at writing poetry, and I love poetry. So let's work together and create a collaborative. So fundamentally, I think we need an education system that is not predicated on survival of the fittest academically and is much more centered on the idea of sharing skills, knowledge, ability, and passion, and creating naturally collaborative people.
That's brilliant. Now, take that to adults, because the problem we're going to have when the system crashes is it's not going to be just the kids in the primary school.
Absolutely.
And so how would you get the same degree of understanding of the purpose of collaboration, the we against the I, of the meaningful employment ideas? How would you do with that with adults? Because we can't ignore the adults, because the majority are adults.
I think you're right, and I think it's a very powerful question, because I think we're looking at two very definite phases in what you're talking about. One is remedial. We've got to find a way to reverse engineer, and education in its longer term is the way we create a more proactive approach. I think the first thing is, again, what happens through formal education to an extent is we teach people that problems are other people's, that actually somebody else will come along and tell you how to solve it, what the problem is in the first place, how to solve it, and will then mark you on whether you've solved it efficiently. How many people in the workplace, you were a leader for many years in a workplace, would present you with the gift of their problem on a Friday before you went home for the weekend, right? And go, thanks for that, Philip, I feel much better. And actually all they've done is given you their problem. So this idea about empowerment, this idea about actually, first of all, we need to be able to identify what our challenges and problems are. We need to have the self-confidence to be able to say, okay, I can take ownership of this. But then it's about the covenantal idea of making sure that there are people around us we can draw on to help us solve that problem, rather than believing our job when this moment happens, when the crash happens, is, well, I'm out of work, I'm not skilled for anything out there, I'm going to give you, the state, my problem and you find the solution for me. And so it's about self-confidence and it's about communication.
Okay, so I'm understanding how we do it. Now, I've talked about the civic trust, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is a new form of governance which is based in the regions, which is a trust. It's asset locked. It's there for people. No shareholder concept. It's about collaboration with all the way you describe it. It's about meaningful work. So crash happens. Government legislates. And again, I think it's interesting. My thoughts are you don't want to force, as soon as you start forcing people to behave in a certain way, they don't trust you. So we have to find a way of educating people on civic trusts, on these concepts of values. It's interesting, British values, what are they? And to me, truth, fairness, and I think virtue is also one of those key. How can we educate adults to understand those virtues? So let's say we create the legislation, we have and it can't be via the court system. The court system is too controlling, it's too hierarchical, and it takes too long. I know that from my own experience, it just takes years and years. How would you start to educate adults? What approach would you adopt to this new set of values, call them British values? How would you educate people?
I think, and if it's all right, I think we'll wrap it on my last word, Philip, if that's okay. Thank you. I think the answer is that we don't have to invent these values. I don't think they're new values. I just think they're values that most of us don't believe we have control of, and therefore we walk away from and feel that it's somebody else's job to provide the virtue, to provide the purpose, to provide the empowerment. And I actually believe that if we're going to find a solution in education, we've got to move away from this idea that teaching people to be controlled will guarantee them a fruitful and purposeful life.